Around the world, ancient people shaped stone, earth, and entire landscapes with a precision that still holds together today, yet many of these places were never meant to be lived in, ruled from, or buried in, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why were they built at all? How did builders, without modern tools, move such massive materials, align their creations to the sky, and repeat the same patterns across cultures that never met? And if archaeology can explain how these sites were made, why does it still struggle to explain what they were truly for, and what knowledge may have quietly slipped out of reach? Sacsayhuamán, Peru. High above the modern city of Cusco, where the air thins and the Andes fold into one another in slow, deliberate ridges, the great stone walls of Sacsaywaman stretch across the hillside with a quiet authority that resists easy explanation, their massive zigzagging lines appearing at once deliberate and enigmatic, as though shaped not only to dominate the landscape but to converse with it. And from a distance, the site can seem almost natural, an extension of bedrock coaxed into order rather than quarried and assembled. Yet as one approaches, the scale becomes unavoidable, with individual stones weighing tens, sometimes hundreds, of tons, fitted together so precisely that even centuries of seismic activity have failed to loosen their joints, a fact all the more remarkable given the region's long history of earthquakes. Archaeological consensus places Sacsayhuamán within the period of Inca imperial expansion during the 15th century, often attributed to the reigns of Pachacuti and his successors, and historical sources describe it as a ceremonial complex and fortress overlooking Cusco, the symbolic heart of the Inca world, whose very layout mirrored cosmological ideas in which the city below was shaped like a puma, and Sacsayhuamán formed its head, a convergence of geography, mythology, and political authority that defined Inca statecraft. Excavations have revealed terraces, towers, and plazas, suggesting large-scale gatherings, ritual activity, and military functions, and yet the most enduring focus remains the walls themselves, composed of limestone blocks cut into irregular polygonal forms that interlock without mortar, a technique seen throughout the Andes, but nowhere executed at this scale or density. The stone surfaces bear subtle curves, recessed angles, and protrusions that allow each block to distribute weight evenly, creating a structural resilience that modern engineers still admire. And while copper and stone tools consistent with Inca technology have been found at quarry sites, the process by which these immense stones were extracted, transported uphill, and fitted with such precision remains only partially understood, reconstructed through experimental archaeology and informed conjecture rather than direct evidence. Some stones show traces of abrasion rather than chisel marks, suggesting prolonged grinding against harder stones, while others display flattened faces that seem to follow internal fracture lines within the rock, implying an intimate understanding of the material's natural tendencies. Yet these explanations coexist uneasily with the sheer labour demands implied, especially in a society without wheeled transport, draft animals capable of hauling extreme loads, or iron tools. Spanish chroniclers, arriving shortly after the Inca Civil War and subsequent conquest, described Sacsayhuamán as unfinished at the time of their arrival, noting towers that no longer exist, and recounting stories of immense labour forces mobilised through the Mite system, but their accounts are coloured by the upheaval of conquest, the dismantling of the site for colonial construction in Cusco, and an understandable tendency to emphasise the exotic and overwhelming nature of what they encountered. Over time, much of Sacsayhuamán was deliberately quarried by the Spanish, its finely cut stones reused for churches, houses, and administrative buildings below, leaving behind only those blocks too massive to move, which paradoxically preserved the most extraordinary portions of the site while erasing architectural context that might have clarified its original function. Geological surveys indicate that the limestone was sourced locally, reducing transport distances, but not eliminating the challenge of moving stones weighing over 100 tons across uneven terrain. And while earthen ramps, rollers, and coordinated human labour offer plausible mechanisms, none fully account for the final precision of the stone joints, which often curve inward and outward in ways that seem designed to resist both gravity and lateral movement. Scholars debate whether Sacsayhuamán was primarily defensive, ceremonial, or symbolic, noting that its elevated position and massive walls suggest fortification, yet the absence of clear battlements, the presence of large, open plazas, and the cosmological alignment of the site point toward ritual and state display as equally important functions, perhaps blending practical defense with ideological messaging in a society where political power was inseparable from sacred order. The site's orientation towards solstitial events and its relationship to surrounding huacas, or sacred landmarks, further embeds it within a broader sacred landscape that extended far beyond its walls, implying that Saksaywaman was not an isolated monument, but a node within a living system of meaning that connected mountains, water sources, celestial cycles, and imperial authority. Still, questions persist, particularly regarding construction sequences, as some lower wall sections appear more refined than upper courses, raising the possibility of phased building campaigns, or even the incorporation of earlier foundations, though no definitive pre-Inca occupation has been confirmed beneath the main structures. Radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic evidence, and tool marks generally support a late horizon construction. Yet the variability in masonry styles across the site invites continued scrutiny, especially given the Inca practice of adapting and monumentalizing existing sacred places. Modern reconstructions and digital models have attempted to visualize the lost towers and terraces, offering insights into sight lines and ceremonial movement. But these remain interpretive, constrained by incomplete data and the irreversible losses inflicted during the colonial period. What remains today is a powerful fragment, a set of walls that seem both finished and unfinished, complete in their endurance, yet incomplete in the stories they can tell, standing as a testament to a civilization capable of extraordinary coordination, material knowledge, and architectural vision, while simultaneously reminding us of the limits of archaeological reconstruction when confronted with monuments designed as much for symbolic permanence as for practical use. Saksaywaman endures not because it defies explanation, but because every plausible explanation reveals further layers of intention, labour, and meaning, inviting continued study without yielding a single satisfying narrative. And in this tension between what is known and what can only be inferred, the site maintains its quiet power, overlooking Cusco as it has for centuries, weathering earthquakes, conquest, and time itself, its stones locked together in a way that suggests not a mystery solved, but one carefully held. Chaco Canyon, USA. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where sandstone mesas rise abruptly from an arid basin and the horizon feels unusually distant, Chaco Canyon unfolds not as a single monument, but as a carefully orchestrated landscape, one that only gradually reveals the depth of its planning and the scale of its ambition, beginning quietly with low walls and shallow depressions before resolving into the massive masonry complexes known today as great houses, structures whose size and precision seem out of proportion to both their remote setting and the sparse resources of the surrounding environment. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, during what archaeologists term the Pueblo II and Pueblo III periods, Chaco Canyon became the central node of a vast cultural network extending across much of the American Southwest, linking communities through roads, trade, ritual, and shared architectural principles. Yet the canyon itself shows little evidence of sustaining a large permanent population, a contradiction that lies at the heart of its enduring questions. The great houses, such as Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, and Hungopavi, were multi-storied complexes containing hundreds of rooms, constructed from finely shaped sandstone blocks, arranged in distinctive core and veneer masonry, a technique that required careful stone selection, consistent craftsmanship, and an organizational system capable of maintaining uniformity across decades, if not centuries, of construction. Tree ring dating has provided unusually precise chronological data, revealing coordinated building episodes that sometimes spanned generations, with timber beams sourced from mountain ranges over 70 kilometers away, including the Chusca and San Mateo Mountains, despite the absence of pack animals or wheeled transport, implying long-distance logistical planning and sustained social cooperation. These beams, cut primarily from ponderosa pine and spruce, were transported across rugged terrain, suggesting not only physical labour but also shared purpose, as no single household could plausibly justify such effort for purely domestic needs. Within the great houses, rooms vary in size and apparent function, with many lacking hearths or signs of daily habitation, while others appear to have been used for storage, ritual preparation, or periodic gatherings, reinforcing the idea that Chaco was less a conventional city than a ceremonial and administrative centre serving dispersed populations. The presence of large, circular kivas, some exceeding 15 metres in diameter and carefully aligned with cardinal directions, further emphasises communal ritual as a defining feature of the canyon, and their repeated architectural elements, bench seating, roof support, sippapus, suggest standardised ceremonial practices shared across the region. Perhaps most striking is the system of engineered roads radiating outward from the canyon, some extending in remarkably straight lines for tens of kilometres, cut into bedrock, bordered by berms, and oriented toward distant communities or prominent landscape features, a scale of infrastructure difficult to reconcile with purely utilitarian transport, especially given their width and the relative scarcity of goods found along them. These roads appear to have functioned as symbolic connectors as much as physical pathways, reinforcing Chaco's role as a central place within a shared cosmological and social framework. Astronomical alignments add another layer of complexity, as several structures appear oriented to solar and lunar events, most notably the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, an observational achievement requiring long-term record-keeping and intergenerational knowledge transmission. And while debates continue regarding the intentionality and extent of these alignments, the recurring patterns suggest that celestial observation was integrated into architectural planning rather than appended as an afterthought. Yet, despite this sophistication, the environmental context of Chaco Canyon presents a persistent puzzle, as the area receives limited rainfall, lacks reliable surface water, and shows evidence of deforestation and soil depletion during its peak occupation, raising questions about how large-scale construction and ceremonial gatherings were sustained without triggering immediate ecological collapse. Some researchers propose that Chaco's fluorescence coincided with a period of slightly increased precipitation, allowing maize agriculture to flourish in outlying areas, while others emphasize the role of stored surplus and imported food, pointing to the canyon's function as a redistributive hub rather than a self-sufficient settlement. The eventual decline of Chaco after the mid-12th century appears to have been gradual rather than catastrophic, marked by reduced construction, fewer imported timbers, and shifting population centres toward regions such as Mesa Verde and the Rio Grande Valley, suggesting adaptation rather than abrupt abandonment, though prolonged drought during this period likely strained the system beyond its capacity. Importantly, there is little evidence of warfare or violent destruction within the canyon, challenging narratives of collapse driven by conflict and instead pointing toward changing social structures, environmental pressures, and evolving religious practices as contributing factors. Modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi and Zuni, maintain oral traditions that reference ancestral migrations through Chaco, viewing the canyon not as a lost civilization, but as a formative chapter in a longer cultural continuum. A perspective that complicates purely archaeological interpretations by emphasizing continuity over disappearance. Despite decades of excavation, survey, and analysis, Chaco Canyon resists simple categorization, functioning simultaneously as ceremonial center, administrative hub, astronomical observatory, and symbolic landscape, without fully conforming to any single model. And it is this multiplicity that continues to draw scholarly attention. Each new dataset, whether derived from dendrochronology, remote sensing, or landscape archaeology, refines the picture while opening new questions about social organization, authority, and motivation. In a society that achieved remarkable coordination without clear evidence of centralized coercive power. In the quiet of the canyon today, where wind moves through the ruins and shadows, trace the outlines of once bustling plazas, the scale of what was accomplished remains evident, not as a mystery rooted in impossibility, but as a reminder of how much can be achieved through shared belief, long-term planning, and collective effort, even in environments that appear at first glance profoundly limiting, leaving Chaco Canyon suspended between explanation and wonder, its great houses standing not as puzzles to be solved once and for all, but as enduring invitations to look more closely at how ancient societies organized meaning, labor, and space across generations. Temple of Abydos, Egypt. On the western edge of the Nile Valley, where desert sand begins to overtake cultivated land and the river's influence fades into silence, the Temple of Abydos stands as one of Egypt's most quietly complex sacred sites. Its significance shaped not by singular monumentality, but by continuity, layering, and an unusual density of meaning that accumulated over millennia, beginning long before the stone walls visible today were set in place. Abydos was revered as a sacred landscape from the earliest dynastic periods, associated with the god Osiris and the concept of rebirth. And by the time monumental temples rose there during the Middle and New Kingdoms, the site had already become a focal point for funerary belief, pilgrimage, and royal legitimacy. The most prominent surviving structure, the Temple of Seti the Val, built in the 13th century BCE, appears at first glance restrained compared to the grand temples of Karnak or Luxor. Yet this restraint conceals a carefully articulated design, one that prioritizes symbolic clarity over spectacle, with axial halls, finely carved reliefs, and an unusual L-shaped plan that subtly redirects movement and attention inward rather than outward. Constructed primarily from limestone and sandstone, the temple's reliefs are among the most refined of the New Kingdom, notable for their depth, precision, and relative lack of later recarving, preserving scenes of ritual offering, divine procession, and royal devotion that reflect a deliberate effort to align Seti the Font with Egypt's most ancient religious traditions. Central to this effort is the Abydos King List, a chronological sequence of royal cartouches carved along a gallery wall, tracing lineage from the earliest dynastic rulers through Seti's own reign, conspicuously omitting periods deemed illegitimate, such as the Amarna interlude, and in doing so presenting not a neutral historical record, but a curated vision of continuity, order, and rightful succession. This act of selective remembrance underscores Abydos' role as a place where history was not merely recorded, but shaped to reinforce cosmic and political stability, a theme echoed throughout the site's architecture and ritual spaces. Beyond the main temple lies the Osirion, a massive subterranean structure traditionally associated with Seti the Firth, but architecturally distinct, composed of enormous granite blocks arranged around a central island surrounded by a water-filled trench, evoking primeval waters and the mythic underworld through scale and symbolism rather than ornament. The Osirion's construction techniques differ markedly from the finely carved limestone of the temple above, relying instead on Cyclopean masonry and simplified forms that have fueled debate regarding its date and purpose, with some scholars proposing it was intentionally archaizing, designed to evoke the deep past and reinforce Osiris's role as a god of resurrection rooted in primordial time. Geological studies suggest that groundwater naturally accumulates within the structure, a feature likely incorporated intentionally, transforming the space into a literal embodiment of mythic rebirth rather than a purely symbolic one. Yet the labour required to excavate and assemble such a structure beneath an already sacred precinct remains striking, especially given the limited practical function such a space would serve outside ritual context. Excavations across Abydos have revealed temples, chapels and tombs spanning from the early dynastic period through the Ptolemaic era, including royal tombs of Egypt's first kings located at el-Ka'ab, reinforcing the site's unparalleled temporal depth and its role as a connective thread linking Egypt's political origins with its later theological elaborations. This continuity complicates attempts to interpret Abydos through a single historical lens, as later constructions were often built deliberately atop or adjacent to earlier sacred features, preserving memory through spatial overlap rather than replacement. Astronomical orientations have been identified in parts of the site, particularly in processional pathways aligned toward the desert and the rising sun, though these alignments appear integrated into ritual movement rather than serving as observational instruments, reflecting a worldview in which cosmic order was enacted through procession, offering, and repetition rather than measurement alone. Despite its importance, Abydos was never a political capital nor a population centre, raising questions about the scale of resources devoted to its maintenance and expansion, especially during periods when Egypt's power was stretched across vast territories. Pilgrimage inscriptions suggest that officials and commoners alike travelled considerable distances to participate in festivals honouring Osiris, reenacting his death and resurrection in ceremonies that bound individual fate to cosmic cycles. Yet the logistics of accommodating such gatherings remain only partially understood, as residential infrastructure within the site itself appears limited. The temple's reliefs, remarkably well preserved, also reveal subtle shifts in religious emphasis, with Osiris occupying a central role alongside Amun and Ra-Horakhti, reflecting the theological synthesis characteristic of the New Kingdom, where local cults were woven into a broader, state-supported cosmology. Later rulers, including Rameses II, added chapels and inscriptions, not to overshadow Seti's temple, but to anchor themselves within its established sanctity, suggesting that Abydos's authority derived as much from its antiquity as from its architecture. Even in decline, the site retained ritual significance, its ruins attracting continued veneration well into the Greco-Roman period, a testament to the durability of its symbolic framework. Modern archaeology has clarified much about Abydos's chronology, construction techniques and religious function, yet the site resists reduction to a single explanatory model, as its power lies not in architectural innovation or technological anomaly, but in the deliberate accumulation of meaning across time, where stone, myth and memory were repeatedly aligned to reaffirm Egypt's understanding of order, death and renewal. Standing among the ruins today, where reliefs catch the light and desert winds move through silent courtyards, Abydos does not present itself as an enigma demanding resolution, but as a layered record of belief, sustained with remarkable consistency, inviting continued study, not because it contradicts what is known, but because it demonstrates how deeply a civilization can invest in the careful preservation of meaning, leaving behind a temple complex that feels less like a monument to a single era and more like a long, unbroken sentence written in stone. Serpent Mound, USA. In the rolling hills of southern Ohio, where forested ridges overlook narrow valleys carved by ancient waterways, the Serpent Mound lies quietly along a plateau edge, its sinuous form emerging only gradually from the surrounding earth. And it is this subtlety that defines the site as much as its scale. For unlike stone monuments or towering architecture, the mound asserts itself through contour and intention rather than height, inviting careful observation rather than immediate awe. Stretching more than 400 meters in length, the effigy depicts an uncoiling serpent with a tightly spiraled tail and a head poised above an oval-shaped enclosure, often interpreted as an egg or a symbolic object. And although the shape is unmistakable once perceived, it remains integrated into the landscape, rising only a meter or so above the ground. Its presence felt more through alignment and movement than mass. Archaeological study places the construction of the Serpent Mound most securely around 1070 CE, during the late Woodland or early Fort Ancient cultural period, based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal found beneath the effigy, though earlier attributions to the Adena culture persisted for decades due to nearby burial mounds and stylistic assumptions, illustrating how interpretations of the site have evolved as methods improved. Unlike many other mound complexes in the Ohio Valley, the Serpent Mound contains no human burials within its form, a notable absence that suggests its purpose was symbolic or ceremonial rather than funerary, distinguishing it from earlier traditions and reinforcing the idea that its meaning lay in representation rather than interment. The mound's placement atop a geologically unusual feature adds another layer of complexity, as it sits near the rim of an ancient meteorite impact structure, now heavily eroded and subtle in expression, but still detectable through disturbed bedrock patterns and geophysical surveys, a coincidence that may have been meaningful to its builders even if not understood in modern scientific terms. From this elevated position, the serpent follows the natural contours of the plateau, its body bending and looping in ways that mirror the surrounding ridgelines, suggesting that its design was adapted to the land rather than imposed upon it, a process that would have required careful planning, repeated adjustment, and a shared mental image sustained throughout construction. Soil analysis indicates that the mound was built through the deliberate layering of earth, with alternating soils selected for stability, showing a level of technical knowledge consistent with other large-scale earthworks of the region, though the labour involved would have been significant, requiring coordinated effort over an extended period without clear evidence of permanent settlement nearby. Astronomical alignments have long been proposed as part of the mound's significance, particularly the orientation of the serpent's head toward the setting sun on the summer solstice, as well as potential alignments with lunar standstills and equinoxes, though scholars caution that such interpretations must account for landscape changes, vegetation cover, and the challenges of precise measurement in an earthwork whose form is organic rather than linear. Still, the repeated association of serpents with celestial cycles in indigenous cosmologies across North America lends contextual support to the idea that the effigy engaged with seasonal rhythms and cosmic order, not as a calendar in the modern sense, but as a symbolic embodiment of cyclical time. The serpent motif itself carries deep resonance, appearing in many Native American traditions as a symbol of fertility, water, transformation, and the boundary between worlds, often associated with horned or feathered serpents that dwell in liminal spaces such as river confluences or skywater thresholds. And while it is not possible to directly attribute specific myths to the builders of the Serpent Mound, the persistence of serpent imagery across cultures suggests a shared symbolic vocabulary rather than an isolated artistic choice. Excavations conducted in the late 19th and 20th centuries revealed few artifacts directly associated with the mound's construction, limiting insight into the daily lives or social organization of its builders. Yet this scarcity itself may reflect the site's role as a place of gathering rather than habitation, visited periodically for ceremonies tied to seasonal or cosmological events. The surrounding region contains numerous other earthworks, enclosures, and village sites, indicating a densely occupied cultural landscape in which the Serpent Mound functioned as a focal point rather than a solitary creation, its prominence derived from form and placement rather than size alone. Over time, erosion, tree growth, and human intervention have altered the mound's profile, necessitating restoration efforts that complicate attempts to reconstruct its original appearance, though early surveys and drawings provide valuable reference points for understanding its intended shape. Despite these challenges, the mound's overall form remains coherent, its curves and proportions suggesting intentional design rather than gradual accumulation. Modern interpretations have at times veered towards speculation, drawn by the mound's evocative shape and lack of explicit explanation, yet responsible scholarship has increasingly emphasized cultural context, comparative analysis and restraint, recognizing that the power of the Serpent Mound lies not in its inexplicability, but in its ability to condense complex ideas into a single enduring gesture carved into the land. For contemporary indigenous communities, the mound represents ancestral ingenuity and spiritual depth, a testament to sophisticated relationships with place, time, and symbolism that predate written records, and efforts to preserve and interpret the site increasingly acknowledge these perspectives alongside archaeological findings. Standing at the edge of the plateau today, where the serpent's head overlooks the valley below, the earthwork does not announce its meaning, nor does it conceal it entirely, instead occupying a space between expression and silence, where form invites contemplation rather than conclusion. The Serpent Mound endures as a reminder that monumental expression need not rely on stone or height to achieve permanence, and that some of the most enduring human statements are those shaped patiently into the land itself, carrying forward questions of intention, belief, and perception that remain open not because answers are unreachable, but because the monument was never meant to resolve them. Bighorn Medicine Wheel, USA. High atop the Bighorn Mountains of northern Wyoming, where alpine winds move unobstructed across open stone, and the horizon unfolds in long, measured distances, the Bighorn Medicine Wheel rests on a limestone ridge at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, its form understated yet unmistakably deliberate, composed not of towering architecture or carved reliefs, but of stones carefully placed to articulate space, direction, and relationship. From above, the structure resolves into a circular cairn, roughly 25 meters in diameter, with a central stone hub connected to the outer ring by 28 radiating spokes, each formed from aligned rocks that appear modest individually but gain significance through their collective order, an order that becomes more apparent the longer one remains within the circle. Archaeological evidence suggests that the wheel was constructed and modified over a long span of time, with initial activity possibly dating as early as 1200 CE, and continued use well into the historic period, making it not a single event frozen in stone, but an evolving site shaped by generations who returned to it with shared purpose. Unlike permanent settlements, the medicine wheel shows no evidence of domestic occupation, no hearths, refuse pits, or structural remains, indicating that it functioned as a place set apart from daily life, visited intentionally and intermittently, its significance deriving from location, form, and repeated use rather than continuous presence. The high elevation itself is notable, as the ridge is accessible only during warmer months, suggesting seasonal visitation aligned with environmental and celestial cycles. And from this vantage point, the surrounding peaks and valleys become part of the monument's experiential field, transforming the landscape into an active participant in whatever activities occurred there. The term medicine wheel, applied broadly to similar stone circles across the northern plains, reflects indigenous concepts of balance, healing, and interconnectedness rather than a singular function. And while it is a modern label shaped partly by early ethnographic interpretation, it gestures toward a symbolic framework in which spatial organization reflects cosmological order. Detailed surveys of the Bighorn Medicine Wheel have revealed alignments between certain spokes and distant mountain peaks, where the sun rises or sets on key astronomical dates, including the summer solstice and the heliacal rising of specific stars such as Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius. Alignments that would have required long-term observation and careful placement rather than casual arrangement. These astronomical relationships are not uniformly precise across all spokes, suggesting that the wheel's design accommodated multiple layers of meaning, rather than serving as a single-purpose observatory, and that different alignments may have been emphasized at different times as knowledge systems evolved. The central cairn, larger than the surrounding stones, anchors the structure visually and symbolically, while the outer ring defines a boundary that is both physical and conceptual, enclosing space without isolating it, allowing movement across the circle rather than restricting access. Smaller cairns, positioned along the rim, appear to mark focal points where spokes terminate, potentially serving as observation stations, offering places for pause, alignment, or ritual action that integrated bodily presence with broader spatial patterns. Excavations at the site have been deliberately limited, reflecting both preservation priorities and respect for its ongoing cultural significance. But surface analysis indicates careful selection of stone size and placement, with an emphasis on stability and visibility rather than monumentality. There is no evidence of quarrying or extensive stone transport. Instead, builders appear to have worked with locally available material, reinforcing the impression that meaning was generated through arrangement rather than transformation of the landscape. Ethnographic accounts from Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Blackfoot, and other plains peoples describe stone circles and high places as sites for vision quests, fasting, healing ceremonies, and communal prayer. And while no single tradition can be definitively assigned to the Bighorn Medicine Wheel, these accounts provide cultural context for understanding its likely role as a place where personal experience intersected with collective cosmology. Such practices emphasize process over permanence, experience over inscription, which helps explain the absence of artifacts or written markers, and the site's reliance on spatial symbolism to convey meaning. The number of spokes, often noted as 28, has been associated with lunar cycles, though scholars caution against assuming direct numerical symbolism without corroborating evidence, especially given that some spokes may have been added or altered over time, complicating attempts to interpret the wheel as a fixed numerical system. What is clearer is that the structure embodies a concern with orientation, with relationships between center and periphery, earth and sky, human presence and distant landmarks, forming a spatial language that communicates through alignment rather than narrative. During the historic period, the wheel continued to attract visitors, including early Euro-American explorers who documented its form with curiosity but limited understanding, often interpreting it through frameworks that emphasized measurement over meaning, a tendency that later archaeological approaches have sought to balance with indigenous perspectives, emphasizing lived experience and oral tradition. Preservation efforts in the 20th century brought increased attention to the site, but also raised questions about access, interpretation, and the challenges of presenting a place whose significance lies partly in its quietness and restraint. Standing within the wheel today, the experience is less about decoding a message than about becoming aware of relationships, of how slight shifts in position alter sightlines to peaks, sky, and horizon, suggesting that the wheel was designed not to deliver information passively, but to engage the participant actively. The Bighorn Medicine Wheel does not assert dominance over its environment, nor does it isolate itself from it, instead functioning as a subtle mediator between human intention and natural order, a role that resists simple classification within modern categories of architecture, science, or religion. Its endurance lies not in stone size or technical complexity, but in the clarity of its spatial logic and the continuity of its use, reminding us that sophisticated systems of knowledge need not announce themselves loudly to be effective. As seasons continue to pass across the ridge and shadows trace familiar paths around the circle, the wheel remains intact, not because it has been fully explained, but because its design accommodates multiple interpretations without being exhausted by any single one, offering a measured reminder that some ancient sites were built not to be understood all at once, but to be returned to, observed, and slowly absorbed over time.